Mist was still on the Buncombe County ridges at 7 in the morning when Corporal Jesse Wade turned his truck up the access road above Asheville, North Carolina. And the temperature in the mountains had not yet decided whether October was over. In the passenger seat, Fern stood up. She looked at the house on the left, the one Jesse had the address for. The intake visit he had driven 40 minutes to make, and then she looked at the house on the right, the smaller one, with the light on in the kitchen and a figure visible through the curtain. Alone at the table, she went to the passenger door. She pressed her nose to the glass. She made no sound. She simply decided what Fern found in that kitchen and what Bobby Malone had been holding in a drawer beside his bed for 7 years, waiting for a Marine and a dog to arrive before he ran out of time to give it, would be the thing that kept Agnes Tiller in her house on the ridge where she had lived for 53 years. Stories like this wonder why this channel exists. If you're new here, subscribe before we go any further. Jesse Wade was 30 years old and had come back from his one tour with the 2nd Marine Division, changed in the specific way of a person who has been to a place where the stakes were actual and who now finds it difficult to be in rooms where people are not paying sufficient attention to what is at stake. This was not a social gift. He had learned to manage it. It worked for a nonprofit veterans services organization in Asheville that sent coordinators to rural Buncombe County to find the veterans and veteran spouses who had fallen out of contact with every system that was supposed to reach them. And the work suited him because it required him to pay attention to the specific, which was the thing he had always been best at. His grandfather, Earl Wade, had raised him from the age of 7, after Jesse's parents left in the ways parents sometimes leave, not all at once, but gradually, then completely. Errol was a Vietnam veteran, 82nd Airborne, 1967 and 1968, and he was the steadiest person Jesse had ever known. Not in the way of people who have never been tested, but in the way of people who have been tested all the way down and found out what they were made of and decided to stay that way. It taught Jesse to fix engines and read weather and understand that the distance between what you were and what you were supposed to be was always precisely the work in front of you. Errol died in Avea Hospital in Asheville in March of 2019, of pneumonia, compounded by complications from a condition that should have been caught 6 months earlier if someone had been paying attention. Jesse was in Helmand when it happened. Nobody reached him in time. He landed back at Lejeune to a voicemail and a date that had already passed, and had been doing this work for the 3 years since because it was the closest he could get to fixing the thing that could not be fixed. He did not talk about this at work or anywhere. It lived in him the way certain things live, not loudly, but with permanent residence, shaping everything around it. Fern was a 3-year-old border collie mix, 45 pounds tricolor with one white paw, and she had been assessing the situation in every room she entered since the day she arrived. She was not a trained service dog. She had no certification and no deployment history, and had been pulled from a breed rescue at 8 weeks old by a coordinator who had decided that Jesse's intake visits needed a coworker. She was the best decision that coordinator had ever made. Fern herded. Not animals. She had never been near stock in her life. She herded people. When someone she had decided was part of her group got separated, she went to them and sat beside them and stayed until the situation was corrected. She had done this 3 times in 3 years, in ways Jesse had needed. A veteran who wandered to the end of a parking lot, a child separated from her mother at a grocery store, and Jesse himself. Once, on a night in January when he had driven to the overlook above Asheville and sat in the truck for 2 hours without getting out. Fern had not asked questions. She had pressed herself against his left side for 2 hours. He had driven home. The call had come from Robert Malone. 2 weeks ago, Bobby. He said. Everybody called him Bobby. And the voice on the phone had been the voice of a man managing the specific economy of a person who has a finite amount of energy and is making deliberate choices about where to spend it. He was 77 years old and had pancreatic cancer, and he said he was fine. He had everything he needed. He didn't want the services for himself. He wanted them for his neighbor. Agnes Tiller, 84, rich address, 2 houses up. She needed the services. He just wanted to make sure someone was going to look after her before he paused, before things changed. Jesse had written down the address. He had meant to go last week. He was going now. Fern was already at the passenger door. Bobby Malone's house was a frame house with a covered porch and a garden that had been put to bed for winter in the precise way of someone who intends to see it come back. It was the house of a man who had not stopped maintaining things because the end was visible. Jesse noted this when he pulled up. The gutters were clean, the porch boards were solid, the firewood was split and stacked under the eave in a way that would keep it dry through April. It knocked. Bobby answered in the time it takes a man to cross a room when crossing a room is not easy. And he looked at Jesse with the clear, evaluating look of a man who has been teaching young people for 35 years and still knows in the first 30 seconds what he is dealing with. He looked at Fern. Fern looked at him. Then Fern walked across the yard to Agnes's house next door and sat down at the front door. Bobby watched her. He looked at Jesse. He said, "Your dog. She goes to people who shouldn't be alone," Jesse said. Bobby held the door wider. Inside, the house was ordered in the way of a man who has been making his arrangements, things put in their proper places, surfaces clear, papers in a stack on the table with a pen on top. Beside the couch was a hospital-style bed, brought in for the last phase of things, and beside the bed was a nightstand with a glass of water and a bottle of pills, and behind them, a manila envelope. The envelope had a name on it, written in the careful handwriting of a man who had understood that the moment for this had been approaching for a long time and had wanted it to be legible. The name on the envelope was Agnes. Bobby sat on the edge of the bed with the care of a man for whom sitting has become a conscious act, and he looked at Jesse and he said, "I have maybe 3 good days left, maybe 4. The hospice nurse is honest with me, which I appreciate." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without self-pity, with the specific dignity of a man who has been teaching people how to look at hard things honestly for 35 years and is not going to stop now. "I called your office 2 weeks ago because I needed someone to get here before Saturday." "What happened Saturday?" Jesse said. "Her daughter Janet has a moving van coming. Agnes is supposed to go to a memory care place in Asheville." He looked at the envelope on the nightstand. "Agnes doesn't want to go. She's said so clearly. Janet has decided Agnes's no is the symptom rather than the answer." He paused. "Agnes is not wrong about what she wants. She's 84, and she has some memory trouble, and she is not wrong about what she wants." Jesse looked at the envelope. "James Tiller gave that to me in 2017, Bobby said. "I knew he was sick. He knew Agnes would fight to stay in her house, and he knew she'd need help fighting. So I had a notarized statement prepared. What Agnes wanted, in her own words, witnessed by 2 neighbors and a notary. He gave it to me because he said I was the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and I wouldn't let them ignore it." He looked at the window, toward Agnes's house. "James died in 2018. I've been holding that envelope for 7 years." Jesse sat with that. Bobby said, "Your grandfather was 82nd Airborne. Vietnam." "Yes, sir. I was 373. Dacto, November of 67. I looked at Jesse the way men look at each other when the thing they share is too large for normal language. "Then you understand why I'm asking." Jesse looked at the envelope. He understood. "Have you ever sat with someone who was running out of time, who had one thing they needed to make sure of before they went, and felt the weight of being the person they chose to ask? If someone like that came to mind just now, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered." He took the envelope and walked across the yard. Agnes Tiller was at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a plate of toast, and a moving box next to her right elbow that she had not packed and had not touched, and was eating breakfast beside Az, though it were furniture rather than the material evidence of a decision made about her life without her consent. The box had her good dishes in it. The tissue paper was visible at the top. She looked up when Jesse knocked and came in, and she looked at Fern, who had been sitting at her front door, and who now came in and lay down at Agnes's feet with the complete, unambiguous commitment of a dog who has decided this is where she is going to be. Agnes looked down at Fern. She looked up at Jesse. She said, "Bobby sent you." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded, the way people nod when they have been waiting for something and it has finally arrived, even if it is later than they would have chosen. She was 84 years old, with white hair and small hands that were still capable of precision. Her kitchen garden was visible through the window, the last of the October kyles still in rows. The beds, put to order, and she had the eyes of a woman who has been paying attention to the world for a very long time and has not stopped. They're going to say I'm confused, she said. I'm not confused. I know exactly where I am and what I want, and I want to stay in my house. She looked at the moving box. I've said this to Janet 14 times in the last 6 months. She has decided it doesn't count. Jessie set the envelope on the table. Agnes looked at it. She looked at her husband's handwriting on the front. Her hands on the coffee cup went still. She did not speak for a moment. He prepared for this, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. He gave it to Bobby for safekeeping in 2017. Agnes looked at the window, toward the ridge, toward the October hills that had been her particular hills for 53 years. She sighed very quietly. He had 7 years left in him when he wrote that. He had 7 years left in him. James Tiller had known what was coming for Agnes, not the memory difficulties which hadn't arrived yet, but the pressure that arrives when a woman lives alone on a ridge at 80, and the people who love her at a distance decide they know better. He had prepared for it 2 years before he died. He had given the preparation to the most stubborn man he knew. Jessie read the document. It was clean and precise. The language of a man who had spent his career in the insurance industry and understood the difference between a wish and a binding statement of intent. Agnes, in her own words, witnessed by 2 neighbors and a notary, stated her wish to remain in her home as long as she was physically safe to do so, and her explicit refusal of any care transition made without her direct, uncoerced consent. The document was legally sound. Jessie was not a lawyer, but it was a man who had spent 3 years doing intake paperwork for a veteran services nonprofit, and he knew what a valid, witnessed, notarized statement of wishes looked like. And this was one. If you were holding that envelope right now, knowing Bobby had hours, not days, and Saturday was coming, and Agnes was at her table next to a box she did not pack, would you have done what Jessie did next? Type yes or no in the comments. I read every one. Janet Oakes arrived at 2 o'clock. She had driven from Charlotte because the hospice nurse had called her to say Bobby's condition had changed, and she came in the way of a person who has been managing a crisis from a distance for 2 years and has arrived in person to find more crisis than she expected. She was in her early 50s, organized, with the look of a woman who has been losing sleep for a long time and is running on the specific fuel of people who believe they are the only person keeping something together. She came into Agnes's kitchen and found Agnes at the table. She found Jessie Wade standing near the counter, and Farron at Agnes's feet, and Reverend Cale from Mountain View Community Church, who had arrived for his weekly visit to Bobby, found Bobby resting and come across to Agnes's at Bobby's direction, seated at the end of the table. She found a woman named Donna from the Ridge, who had been Agnes's neighbor for 30 years and who had seen Jessie's truck in the yard and come over without being asked, because that was what people did on this ridge, had always done on this ridge, and who was sitting in the chair by the window with her hands folded. Janet looked at the room. She looked at Jessie. She sighed with the careful voice of a person who has been in similar rooms before. I appreciate everyone's concern. This is a family decision, and Agnes and I have discussed. Fern's head came up from Agnes's feet. The sound that came from her was not a bark. It was the low, continuous, even sound of a border collie who has decided that this particular situation is not going to move in the direction it is currently pointed. She did not leave Agnes's side. She sat up fully, her eyes on Janet, her weight forward, her one white paw planted. Janet looked at the dog. She looked at the document on the table which Jessie had placed where she would see it when she walked in. That's your father's handwriting, Jessie said. It kept his voice at the same register it had been all morning. Even, specific, unhurried. It's a witnessed, notarized statement of Agnes's wishes prepared by your father in 2017 and held in trust by Bobby Malone for 7 years. It states, in Agnes's own words, that she wishes to remain in her home as long as she is physically safe to do so, and that no care transition should be made without her direct, uncoerced consent. He paused. The document is valid. A property and elder law attorney in Asheville named Carol Brewer has reviewed a photograph of it this afternoon and confirmed its validity. I can give you her number. Janet looked at the document. She looked at her mother's hands on the coffee cup, which had not moved since Janet came in. She looked at Reverend Cale, who looked back at her with the expression of a young pastor who has been doing weekly visits to a dying man for 3 months and has heard more than once, what that dying man thought about what was happening to his neighbor. She looked at Donna by the window. She said to Agnes, "Mom, Dad would have, James would have fought." 5 words, Agnes sighed them quietly, with the flat certainty of a woman who has known a person for 60 years and who understands the standard that person represents. And who knows exactly what that standard requires of the people who claim to honor it. Janet's hand, on the doorframe, went still. Fern did not move. Jesse said nothing. He had said what needed saying. He stood in the kitchen of a house on a Buncombe County ridge and waited for the room to do what rooms sometimes do when a truth has been placed in them that is too complete to argue with. Janet looked at the document for a long time. She looked at the moving box on the table, her own decision, made from 3 hours away, mad with love and fear and exhaustion, and the genuine belief that she was protecting her mother from harm, and something happened on her face that was not the face she had arrived with. It was a different face, a daughter's face. She sat down at the table across from Agnes. She looked at her mother for a long moment. She said very quietly, "I didn't know he did that." Agnes looked at her daughter. She reached across the table and put her hand over Janet's hand. "I know," Agnes said. "He was that kind of man." Fern put her chin down on her paws and closed her eyes, the way dogs close their eyes when something has been resolved. The moving van was canceled on Thursday morning. Cattle Brewer prepared a formal Care Wishes document that formalized the 2017 statement under current North Carolina elder care law. With Agnes's renewed signature and Janet's acknowledgement, Janet drove back to Charlotte on Friday and came back the following weekend, not with a plan but with food. She brought biscuits from a bakery she passed on I-26, and she and Agnes sat at the kitchen table in the way of a mother and daughter who have said the difficult thing and are on the other side of it. And that was a beginning. Bobby Malone died on a Sunday morning 4 days after Jesse's visit, in his house on the ridge, in the bed beside the nightstand where the envelope had been for 7 years. Reverend Calais was with him. Jesse was not there. He had been with Bobby the evening before. I'd sat in the chair beside the bed while Bobby talked about Dacto and James Tiller and a history classroom in Buncombe County and what it meant to teach young people that the past was not finished. With them, and he had held Bobby's hand when Bobby's energy ran out. And Bobby had said, "She'll stay on the ridge." Jesse had said, "She'll stay." The congregation at Mountain View Community Church organized a care rotation for Agnes that winter. Meals, rides, company, with the specific efficiency of a community that has been doing this for each other for 100 years and requires no instruction. Donna coordinated the schedule on a shared calendar. By November, it had 17 names on it. Agnes tended her kitchen garden through November and into the first weeks of December, until the cold made it impractical. And even then, she went out in the mornings to check the beds in the way of a woman who understands that preparation for next year begins in winter. Fern came with her on the Tuesdays and Thursdays that Jesse's route brought him back up the ridge, and Fern stayed at Agnes's feet when Jesse had paperwork to do inside. Anne Fern sometimes slept on the porch in the afternoon, and Agnes brought her a folded blanket without being asked, and that was the arrangement. There are moments that feel like the answer to a question you didn't know was still open. Bobby Malone had been carrying a piece of paper for 7 years with one instruction implicit in the keeping of it. Find the right person to give this to. He called a Veterans Services number on a Tuesday morning in October, and a young man with a border collie showed up on a Thursday, and Bobby looked at them and understood. He had gone into Dacto at 22 years old, in a formation that came out smaller than it went in, and he had spent the rest of his life teaching young people that the past was not finished with them. And on the last Tuesday of his lucid life, he had said, "Don't let them take her." Jesse had not let them take her. He drove back down the Ridge Road that Thursday evening with Fern in the passenger seat, and the October mountains going dark on both sides. And they thought about Earl Wade in a VAA hospital in 2019, and about a voicemail he had received on a Sunday in March that told him a date that had already passed, and about the specific weight of not being there when the person you love most in the world needed you to be. He had not been there for Earl. He had been there for Agnes. He was not sure, and would never be entirely sure, whether those two things canceled each other. He thought they did not cancel. He thought they were simply both true. The way certain things are simply both true, and that what you did with that was to keep driving and keep showing up, and to have the kind of dog beside you who would not let you sit too long at an overlook in January without pressing herself against your side until you drove home. He kept driving. This story is for everyone who was asked to keep a promise by someone who was running out of time to ask. And for every James and Bobby, every person who prepared for the people they loved, quietly, without announcement, trusting someone else to carry it. Is there someone in your life who built something their whole life that deserves to stay built? A veteran, a parent, a neighbor on a rich road who has been meaning to be visited? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one, and this section fills with names of people who deserve to stay where they belonged. Every story on this channel is about the promise kept. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.